Thank you, sir. Thank you, Donnie. Y'all, it is a beautiful Lord's Day. Every breath is precious. I can say that from personal experience, actually. This morning, we have a special speaker. We always have a special speaker. But this morning, you will be introduced to somebody you may not know, and then maybe you know this man. Johnathan Nowak. Johnathan Nowak is the son of John Novak, who's sitting in the back. Not a lot of imagination there with the name, but he spells it Johnathan, so that helps. But Johnathan was born in Homewood. Now, I believe he was born in a hospital in Homewood, but not far from here. And then, somehow, he was able to convince the lovely, the talented, the brilliant, and the saintly Stacy Lawley, now Stacy Lawley Novak, to marry him. They have produced 3 beautiful children. They're starting to sleep again now. It's more or less. Okay. Johnathan has an exceptional career. He is an exotic car mechanic. He's worked on all sorts of stuff, specializing now at Duffy's Garage on German cars. The most exotic, I was quizzing Johnathan, a 1961 190 SL. Does anybody have one of those? Do you need an oil change? Okay. Also, all sorts of other stuff. An interesting guy to know. Johnathan is a man of many talents. He plays the guitar. He is an artist. And he plays at the table, which is coming up, what's the date? The 19th. Okay. Please help me welcome a man who was quoted just the other day saying, "If you feel you are in control, you are not going fast enough." Johnathan Nowak.
Guten Morgen, Bruder und Schwestern. Danke, dass du mich heute Morgen in deiner Klasse hast. Im Laufe der Jahre schneit der Einfluss meines Großvaters, Hans Nowak, auf Familie, Freunde und Bekannte scheinbar immer präsent. Good morning, brothers and sisters. Thank you for having me in your class this morning. Over the years, the influence of my grandfather, Hans Novak, on family and friends and acquaintances is seemingly always present. Having grown up in the Church of Christ in the Birmingham area, the name Hans Novak has always carried with it a great weight of admiration and thankfulness. I've been approached countless times by people all over to be told stories of how he touched their lives, how he spoke at their congregations, and how he baptized so many across the world into Christ. Now, to me, Hans was always that interesting grandfather that kind of had a bit of a funny accent and who had this massive collection of German trains, which was a love that he bestowed on me at a young age, and now I luckily have most of his collection and share that with my children and as many people as I can. Hans was just a special man. At holidays, Christmas was his thing. And he always enjoyed having the children around. But at such a young age, as we all do, I failed to realize the importance of who was in my life. It wasn't until years after his passing that his presence in this world and the effect that it left on me became known. Give a little backstory on Hans. He was born in Aussig, which at the time was part of the Sudetenland, formerly Germany. And during his young life, his family became disrupted by, of course, the rise of the Nazi regime. At about age 16, he and his friends were sent off into the work camps of the Wehrmacht, or the German military. Not something they wanted to do, but something they had to do as part of being in the state. Luckily, we have a diary that he made from that time all the way through his youth, and his sister Helga translated it all for us, so we can see the details of his life at that time, which it's very interesting to see a 16-year-old put in those situations where you hear about the horrors of war, even for people of the country and what they dealt with, losing the family business. He had a friend that committed suicide because of what they witnessed while at these work camps. The city of Dresden was a place that they would often go to, and they watched it burn from the Allied bombing. But the contrast was he was 16 years old. He talked about the cute girl that he saw in the square, and he would talk about the times that he had with his friends. And luckily, the effects of going through all that didn't seem to cause a whole lot of harm on him. But it wasn't till years later when his life really started to change. In about 1947, a gentleman by the name of Roy Palmer baptized my grandfather into Christ. From there, he went to the College of Economics and Business in Frankfurt and graduated from there in 1948, and then went on to Lipscomb and graduated from there in 1952. He began his preaching career in 1948, visiting various cities throughout Europe, mainly Stuttgart and Kaiserslautern, and then moved on to the world-renowned city of Cookeville, Tennessee, with further preaching in Boulder, Colorado, and then ending up in the Birmingham area, speaking at many churches in the area. His mission work, and this may be a little biased, but his mission work is quite legendary. He traveled all over the world, preaching to countless people, visiting places like South Africa, Central America, Russia, USSR at the time, the Ukraine, Romania, China, and many other places. I ran out of room to write all those. And he was fluent in both his native German, English, and Russian. My dad and I were going through a bunch of his stuff so I could try to find as much information I could and try to get a feel for how Hans would preach and speak to people, and found a box full of tapes that were Hans Novak Russian lessons, about 60 tapes, organized, very German-like, all rewound properly, ready to go to learn the next lesson. Now, all of these things are amazing. And it's just the tip of the iceberg for what Hans did in the work of the church and in the work of God. And I never really understood or took to heart what he did and how special it was, but also thought, how could one man affect and impact so many people? I mean, aside from Jesus. That is until about 9 or 10 years ago. I was talking with my wife, and we were still in that newlywed stage, really getting to know each other. We've known each other since kindergarten, but it isn't until you live with somebody and you go through all that you really start learning all the things about them. She mentioned, we were discussing something, and she mentioned one little story from when she was little. I'm sure those of us from the area remember when the Festival of Trees used to be held at the BJCC. It's a huge event. Children's Hospital put on, and I think did most of the trees. All the different groups of the church, or the hospital, would have a tree. The Boy Scouts had things there. They were just a really, really big deal. And my mother-in-law, Dee, she's a longtime children's employee, and she likes to head up everything. So she was head of putting together the tree for her group from the hospital. At that time, the life that my wife was living with her mother, and interesting enough with what Brett said this morning, father not as present, not one that needed to be present. So Stacy would go with her mom everywhere, which, to Dee's credit, she included her daughter in everything. But when you've got a little girl stuck in the BJCC, everybody working, she didn't have much to do. gets a little bored, so she starts wandering around. Well, excuse me, she sees this man standing over the platform, surrounded by tables, full of gingerbread houses, setting up trains, these big, pretty green and red German trains. And so she watches him, keeps her distance because she's pretty respectful when it comes to people being busy, even as a child. But then he notices her, and he calls her over. And she gets up on that platform and just watches him work. She recalled how kind he was and how at a time in her life when the world was not a happy place, he made her feel comfort, kindness, and welcomed. And to him it was nothing. He loved children. Christmas, let me tell you, Christmas at the Novak house was something else. The way that Hans would dote on the children, hand out presents, be given a present himself and go, nice, and put it down, only to go back to the children to focus on them. But to Stacy, it was life-changing almost. So sadly, she never got to meet him as his granddaughter. But God made sure that he met her regardless and left an impact on her life from just that one chance meeting. So I've spent time going through a box packed full of Hans' sermons. I brought one right here. It's from the campus ministry back in 1993, all those years ago. Some of them are handwritten, most of them are typed, and feeling the old 60s and 70s typewriter paper, even for someone as young as myself, it takes you back to kind of that simpler time. Some of them are in German, some in Russian, most of them are in English. And the dates, they range from the 60s all the way up to the mid-90s when he was still preaching. As I poured over these papers, and if you can imagine a stack of this kind of paper about that deep, I've read a lot of his sermons in the last couple of days. There's one theme that is constant through all of it, and that's love. Titles of his sermons go from church growth to relations with your neighbor, dealing with inner demons, knowing thy Lord, as quoted, and the gospel in one sentence. All of them discuss love, the love God has for us, and that which we should freely give to all. That's why Hans traveled to all these dangerous countries, to preach to those without the knowledge of Jesus. That's why Hans went to countries where in his youth, after the war, his own people were mistreated, yet he preached to those people because he loved Jesus, and he wanted to share that love with those people. That's also why he called a lonely child to his side and showed her the love of Jesus by quietly building his model train set. It doesn't take a prophet or a scholar, a priest or anyone of significance to change a life or to impact a life with the love of Christ. It takes brothers and sisters like us in this room to go out and take that love that Jesus put on us and just to give it away freely. One of the things that Hans used in all of his sermons, as any good preacher does, is a story. And one of these stories kind of stuck with me, and I'm gonna try to read it through his notes. And you may have heard it before. It says, there's a father in India who has 3 sons, and he sends them up to the highest mountain peak around the village, and he says, bring me back a token to show how far you have climbed. Well, the first son returned with a wildflower. I said, Father, look, I brought you this beautiful wildflower. And the father knew how high those flowers would grow, just above the tree line. So then the second child returns and brings him these chunks of red flint stones. And of course the father knew how far up those stones could be obtained. But then the third one was gone for quite a long time. And when he came back, the father said, what have you brought me? And the son said, where I went there was nothing to bring back. But I stood at the summit and looked out upon a valley where 2 great rivers join the ocean. the father beamed at his son and said, "The ambition of my life is that one of my sons should see what I have seen. You have nothing in your hands, but you have the greatest thing, a vision in your soul, and that is the greatest of all." And reflecting on that story, I'm pretty positive that Hans's vision was to help save as many souls as he possibly could. I Googled him online just to see what was out there, and countless articles that I found that discussed his obituary, that discussed his time preaching and ministering to people. The point that was always made was his love of people, his strong faith, and the love that God gave him. He was able to do that. And I think it's something that, we should take in and say, it is so easy for us in this city to just love our neighbor. God tells us to go out and love. So that's kind of all I have for today on that. I want to end with this little poem that a gentleman that knew my grandfather was an evangelist out of North Alabama, Basil Overton. He wrote this little poem in late 1999, shortly after my grandfather passed away. And it's just something that I think we could all take to heart. It says, "With compassion for the lost, the German man went to many lands, wielding the sword of the Spirit with strong heart and hands. He laid down the sword of the Lord when he breathed his last breath. In a land far from his own, he answered the call of death." Thank you.